Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today we are going to talk about how God designed your nervous system. This is very important to understand because your nervous system kind of runs your life. And the most important thing you have to understand about your nervous system is that it is organized around one thing: feeling safe. Feeling safe. Which means that you are fundamentally driven by an attempt to survey your environment and determine how safe it is. Now, when most people hear this, they hear it as, if a lion walked around the corner, my brain would immediately say, danger, danger. And that's true. However, lions don't walk around the corner very often, but people do. Your spouse does, your partner does, your friends, coworkers, bosses, extended family members. God has designed your nervous system to continually survey your relational environment. That is, your relationships with other people. And the purpose of all this surveying is to answer the simple question, am I safe? Or better said, how safe am I? Your nervous system comes equipped with an exquisite ability to detect how safe you feel at any given moment. This ability is called neuroception. Neuroception is a term coined by Stephen Porges, who is a neuroscientist, and today's episode is a summary of some of the key contributions that Stephen Porges has made to understanding how and why we relate to other people the way we do. Neuroception is your body's way of constantly surveying the environment for any danger whatsoever. Neuroception is an ability that you have, and it is very important for you to understand that God has equipped your brain with this ability. Neuroception is different than perception. When you are perceiving something, say a beautiful sunset, you are aware that you are looking at this beautiful sunset. You know that it's happening. Neuroception, on the other hand, occurs without conscious awareness. Neuroception is detection without awareness. It is the way your nervous system takes in information and responds to that information without your awareness. This is a big deal. This means that your brain is constantly surveying your relational world to assess the level of physical and emotional safety, and your brain is doing this without you knowing it, all the time. Neuroception occurs automatically in milliseconds, and it's always turned on. The important point to remember is that we aren't aware that we are scanning the environment for signals of safety or danger. We aren't conscious that we are continuously engaged in the process of neuroception. It just happens. Neuroception is an extremely important concept to understand. Why? Because neuroception is a big part of what's driving your interpersonal relationships. More on that in a moment. Many things can make you feel unsafe. A fight between two people in a public place. An angry look on your friend's face. A sarcastic tone in your partner's voice. When your body scans the environment and detects anything that feels remotely threatening, it triggers your nervous system to do one of three things. One of three things. Socially engage, that's the first thing, which means to talk to the other person. The second thing is to go into a fight, flight, freeze reaction. In other words, yell at the other person, run away from them, or just freeze up in a state of paralysis. And the third thing is shutting down. And I'll explain this option later, but for now, simply make a mental note that shutting down is different than freezing. Very different. So let me say what I just said again. When your body scans the relational environment and detects anything that feels remotely threatening, it triggers your nervous system to do one of three things. Number one, socially engage. Number two, go into a fight, flight, freeze reaction. Or number three, shut down. Now, each of these three responses talking to the other person, fight, flight, freeze, and shutting down. Each of these three responses is driven by a different part of your nervous system. So you've got three possible responses to conflict, and each of these three responses is driven by a different part of your nervous system. What I'm about to summarize is known as polyvagal theory, which was developed again by Stephen Porges. Polyvagal theory. Poly meaning many, and vagal refers to your vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is a huge nerve that begins in your brainstem and innervates all of your organs, your heart, your lungs, your gut, everything. Polyvagal theory refers to the fact that your vagus nerve has multiple branches. Poly, multiple. So, your body comes equipped with three possible responses to danger or conflict, and each of these three responses is driven by a different part of your nervous system. Social engagement, i.e. talking to the other person, is the first possible response. Social engagement is driven by the ventral vagal complex. Now, this is just a fancy scientific name for a particular portion of your vagus nerve, namely the ventral portion. The ventral portion of the vagus nerve innervates the heart and lungs, everything above the diaphragm. The second possible response to danger or conflict is the fight, flight, freeze response. And this response is driven by a different part of your nervous system called your sympathetic nervous system. The third possible response is shutting down or collapse. Shutting down is driven by a different part of your nervous system called your dorsal vagal complex. And again, this is just a fancy scientific name for a particular portion of your vagus nerve, namely the dorsal portion. The dorsal portion of the vagus nerve innervates the stomach, liver, intestines, everything below your diaphragm. Now, bear with me. I know that's a lot of big science words, but here's all you need to hold in your mind for the moment. Number one, your nervous system is continuously evaluating your relationships for how safe they are. Number two, your nervous system comes equipped with three ways of responding to anything that feels unsafe. 3 ways. And number three, each of those three responses, each of those 3 ways of responding is guided by a different part of your nervous system. That's the big picture. What I want to do is explain why understanding these 3 points will bring you to a new level of understanding about why you react to things the way you do, especially when you are experiencing conflict or distress in relationships. God designed our brains primarily to do one thing: make sure we don't die. As a result, anytime your brain detects even the slightest hint of danger, it alerts you to do something to restore safety again. Your body automatically follows a particular sequence of responses as it attempts to avoid danger and restore safety. This is very important. Let me say it again. You automatically follow a particular sequence of responses as you attempt to avoid danger and restore safety. And that sequence corresponds to the 3 possible responses we've already named. In other words, first possible response, socially engage. Second, fight, flight, freeze. Third, shut down. And why do you do these things? To restore safety, either physical safety or relational safety. What I'm going to do now is elaborate on each of these 3 possible responses and explain how you determine which one of the 3 to do. Because you determine it automatically and unconsciously. This is what your nervous system does. So, first possible response. The first thing you will do when you begin to feel the teeniest bit of conflict is you will use your words and facial expressions and tone of voice to try to reduce the conflict and restore connection with the other person so you feel safe again. This is called the social engagement system because you socially engage with the other person via words, facial expression, and tone of voice. The social engagement system refers to a group of neural networks that regulate your facial muscles. And your social engagement system is mediated by the ventral portion of the vagus nerve. That is the part that connects to your face, heart, and lungs. Now, here's a crucial point to understand. Your body will automatically and unconsciously determine if talking to the other person is going to work to restore safety. How? How can my body do that? Through neuroception. God made your nervous system with this insanely exquisite ability called neuroception, which unconsciously determines whether or not talking to the other person is going to help to restore a sense of safety. So for example, let's get practical. An example. If an angry person starts yelling at you on the street, your neuroceptive abilities will automatically and unconsciously determine if talking to this person is going to work. In other words, if talking to this person might restore safety. If your neuroceptive abilities judge that engaging with the angry person might restore safety, then you will use all the words, facial expressions, and tones of voice at your disposal to restore safety. That's the social engagement system. It is always the first thing you will do when you detect the slightest bit of relational danger. Unless, and this is a very important unless your neuroceptive abilities tell you that socially engaging is not going to work. It's not going to restore safety. And if that is the judgment of your neuroceptive abilities, you will move on to the second possible response, which is fight, flight, or freeze. The evaluative process of neuroception happens in milliseconds, a fraction of a second. It is lightning fast, and it is all unconscious. Okay, I want to make this really practical by inviting you to start thinking about one of your more intimate relationships. Picture what happens when there is relational disagreement, when there is conflict. In other words, picture what happens when socially engaging doesn't work. When talking to the other person does not bring connection again. Call to mind a fight with your spouse or a close friend, a fight in which something in you realized that talking calmly, social engagement, was not working to make you feel seen, heard, and understood. In other words, safe. Talking calmly was not getting the job done of restoring a sense of relational safety and relational connection. In this situation, your body will say, okay, it's time to move on to response option number 2, which is to either fight, get angry back, flee, leave the room, or freeze, stay in the room in a panicked frenzy that outwardly looks like paralysis. More on that in a minute, the freeze response. This response, fight, flight, freeze, option B, option number 2, and I realize it's actually 3 responses rather than 1, but they're all grouped together because they are all driven by the same part of your nervous system, the sympathetic branch of your nervous system. This is the second response that you will automatically and unconsciously begin executing if your neuroception concludes that talking to the other person isn't going to work. And this second possible response, fight, flight, freeze, is driven by your sympathetic nervous system. So, response option A, number 1, is the social engagement system, which is driven by the ventral portion of your vagus nerve. Response option B, number 2, is fight, flight, freeze, and it is driven by your sympathetic nervous system. Now, think about a conflict with someone. Who among us has not shifted into our sympathetic nervous system and begun to fight, flee, or freeze with our partner in the midst of conflict? This happens all the time. Here's what it looks like. You know that your fight response is kicking in when you start raising the volume of your voice and increasing the intensity in your voice. You know that your fight response is kicking in when you start getting a more serious look of anger and intensity on your face. When you start shooting your spouse with darts, which you think of as carefully constructed sentences designed to get your point across and persuade them to see you, hear you, understand you, respond to you. That's the fight response. That's all fight. What about flee? The flee response is kicking in when you feel something inside of you want to leave the room or the house. You want to get away. You may, in fact, get up and leave the room or leave the house. Or you may just feel the bodily urge to leave the room. But the point is that your body is mobilized to flee. Both the fight response and the flight response mean that your sympathetic nervous system is in high gear. In other words, you are amped up inside. Your heart rate has increased. You are hyper aroused. Your body has become energized to fight or energized to flee, but it's energized. You are very activated, hyper aroused. Now, what about the freeze response? This is very important to understand because a lot of people misunderstand this when their partner is actually doing it. Have you ever been in a fight with a loved one and your loved one just freezes up? You are making your points. You are saying what you have to say. You are trying to get them to see you and hear you and understand you and respond to you. And you watch their face just go blank. And they look like they aren't even listening to you. In that moment, you tend to think they could care less about what I'm saying. They do not care at all. Here's what I want you to know. You may be very wrong in your interpretation of their face. They may actually be in a highly activated sympathetic nervous system state called freeze. They look utterly calm and nonplussed on the outside, but inside they are completely amped up and hyper aroused. Here's an example to illustrate this point. I have a friend here in Fort Collins who has a friend in Seattle who ran into a mountain lion several years ago. The friend of my friend is walking along a trail and a mountain lion comes out of the tall grasses. The man froze. He stared at the mountain lion in utter stillness for several minutes, and the mountain lion stared back. The man's face went blank. His body became perfectly still. He was in the freeze state. In other words, even though he looked shut down on the outside, he was hyper aroused on the inside. Of course he was. He's looking at a mountain lion. He was on high alert. Now, ask yourself, do you really think this man doesn't care about the mountain lion? Of course he cares about the mountain lion. Nothing is more important to him in that moment than this mountain lion. But when our partner freezes, when they get that blank look on their face, we tend to think they don't care about us. In reality, the reason they are frozen may be because they care so much about us. You might be the mountain lion in that moment. And by the way, why did the friend of my friend freeze? Why did he freeze? Because in a nanosecond, his neuroceptive abilities discerned that neither fighting nor fleeing was going to restore safety. He couldn't fight this mountain lion, and he couldn't outrun it. Do you see the brilliance of his neuroception? If he had fought or fled, he'd be dead. But he's alive because he froze, and the mountain lion became disinterested and went away. Remember, your nervous system is designed by God to keep you alive. Okay, so far we've discussed the first two responses: social engagement, which is driven by the ventral portion of your vagus nerve, and fight, flight, freeze, which is driven by your sympathetic nervous system. When things get a little unsafe, or there's a small conflict with another person, the first thing your body does is socially engage. If, through the process of neuroception, you realize that social engagement is not going to work, it's not going to restore a safe connection with the other person, the second thing your body does is fight, flight, freeze, which is driven by your sympathetic nervous system. But what about when that doesn't work? What about when your neuroception makes you realize that neither fighting, nor fleeing, nor freezing is going to make the danger go away? What about when your neuroception determines that fighting isn't going to restore connection and safety? That yelling at your partner or raising your voice isn't going to make them see your point? That fleeing to another room isn't going to work? What happens when your body realizes, no matter what I say or do, nothing is going to get the other person to see me, hear me, understand me, respond to me? In this moment, your body shifts into the third possible response, which is the shutdown response. But I'm going to save my discussion of the shutdown response for the next episode. Here's what I want to leave you with. We're not done yet. Here's what I want to leave you with. When you have conflict with another person, that is, when your nervous system senses that there is rupture or division or misunderstanding between you and the other person, your nervous system goes on alert. Your nervous system believes that disconnection from someone, relational rupture, equals danger. As far as your nervous system is concerned, whenever there is relational rupture with your spouse, with a loved one, you are in the midst of danger. Why? By the way, why? Why does your nervous system believe that relational disconnection is dangerous? Because human beings are mammals, and all mammals need reciprocal interaction with those closest to them to feel safe. If the most important person in the world to you isn't there for you, or if you don't feel like they are there for you and that they care about what's important to you and that they'll respond to you when you need them, if you don't feel those things, then your nervous system says you are in danger. And so your nervous system unconsciously evaluates the danger through neuroception and then shifts your body into a different bodily state. Your nervous system shifts you out of the ventral vagal state of social engagement and into the sympathetic nervous system state of fight, flight, or freeze. Okay, I know this may have been a lot of new information all at once. You may need to go back and listen again. It has taken me 3 years to understand this well enough to teach it. It's not easy, but it's very important. And if you listen next time, not only will I explain the shutdown response, but I will put more words to why understanding polyvagal theory is worth your time. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Place We Find Ourselves. Remember, if you want to listen to episodes as soon as they are released, you have to get the app, the Place We Find Ourselves app, because episodes release to the app before they release to iTunes, Apple Podcasts, everywhere else. And it costs $3 per month or $30 per year in order to get these episodes immediately. But your money is supporting the podcast, for which I am deeply grateful. I'll have a new episode in 2 weeks.